right, thanks for joining us for part 2 of our midweek Bible study this week. We're continuing on through Matthew chapter 16. We're going to start in verse 24, and we'll go through the end of the chapter here. And as we do this, you'll see that we're really building very extensively on the context, what's been happening through chapter 16 and even the previous chapters. Let's go ahead and start reading chapter 16 of Matthew, starting in verse 24. It says, "Then Jesus told his disciples, 'If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in return for his soul? For the Son of Man is going to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay each person according to what he has done. Truly I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom.'" All right, so as we encounter this passage, it's important for us to remember that this is following right on the heels of what this interaction was between Jesus and Peter. Remember, Jesus says, "Hey, I'm going to go to Jerusalem, I'm going to suffer, and I'm going to be killed by the religious leaders." And Peter says, "Hey, no." And he rebukes Jesus, says, "No, this isn't going to happen to you." And Jesus responds, "Get behind me, Satan. This is not, you're not having the things of God in mind, but the things of man." And we talked about how that was a reference to this issue of Jesus drawing a distinction between the kingdom of man and just an elevated, a better kingdom of man versus the kingdom of God. And the kingdom of man will kill for its establishment, but the kingdom of God will die for its establishment. And what happens here now is that he's outlined this difference in the kingdom. Jesus is going to die to inaugurate the kingdom of God. And then he says, if you want to follow after me, you have to do the same thing. You have to die for the kingdom of God. And now this is this is a pretty significant thing for Jesus to ask of his disciples. This is a pretty significant elevation of the call of discipleship for Jesus. Now, let's understand this in the larger context here. Jesus is not only saying that he's going to die for the kingdom of God, but that membership in the kingdom of God requires this death. This is not just the mark of the person who establishes the kingdom of God. This is the mark of the citizen of the kingdom of God. Now, what are we to make of this? Well, we talked about in our sermon this last week the idea of giving and how the idea of giving is fundamental to our happiness, and it's also fundamental to the idea of living in a covenant. Now, the thing that's important for us to grasp is we live in covenants all the time. We just fail to recognize it. We have the covenant of marriage, which is an obvious one. People will largely hang on to that, but we live in a lot of covenants. Anytime you represent an entity or a group and they represent you, you're living in a covenant. So even a simple thing is if you have a baseball team, let's say it's the church softball team, if you're on that team so that you represent the team and the team is you, that the team doesn't exist without you. There's nothing there. If every person disbands from the team no longer exists. The people are the team is the people. You're living in a covenant. Now, these covenants can be major covenants, they can be minor covenants. They have appropriate levels of kind of living our lives for them or of giving. For instance, if you're part of, let's say, a team that's trying to win the championship and you're not doing very good at batting, you might say, well, I have an obligation to become a better batter so that the team can win the championship. Another example of living in a covenant is working for a company. And the company is made up of its employees. That's what the company is. And the employees represent the company. And you might say, well, I need to work on my sales skills. I need to work on my organizational skills, my leadership skills, because I owe that to the company. Now, the problem is that in all the obligations, or excuse me, all the covenants that we live in, these covenants always come with these obligations. The problem is that for most of us in our lives, in order for us to be happy, we want to maximize what we're getting out of the covenant and minimize what we're giving to the covenant. That's the problem with the kingdom of man. That's the nature of the kingdom of man. And so you saw this all through the Bible. You see this with David. Remember how he treats Uriah, who is married to Bathsheba. And this is a guy that's being faithful to David and is under David's command. And David sees his wife, covets his wife, sends him out into the battle to be killed so that he can have his wife. That is that's human kingship. Human kingship is always concerned first with itself, which is a destruction of the covenant. So the covenant consists actually of living for the other person and having them live for you, which is why Jesus says in the previous passage that the inauguration of this kingdom, or the mark of this kingdom, is going to be his death for the people. This is what it means to covenant in God's eyes. This is what the covenant is in God's eyes. God is completely 100% for us, and Jesus' death is the ultimate sign of this. There can be no greater sign of Jesus or of God's love for us, of his desire to bless us, of his living for us, than Jesus dying on the cross. And so it's understanding that, it's easy to see how then taking up our cross and following Jesus is the mark of the kingdom of God. You see, the problem is that Jesus had warned about the yeast of the leaven, the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Remember, the Pharisees and the Sadducees are aggrandizing themselves through the system, and this is the opposite of real covenantal living. And he warned his disciples about this. Don't be like them. Don't just make a system for your benefit and then call it the kingdom of God, or call it religious, or call it godly, or call it faithfulness, or whatever words you want to use to try to elevate yourself. Don't do that, because this is nothing like what the kingdom of God is. And that's why Jesus has such a hard problem with them in terms of healing on the Sabbath. Jesus, from the kingdom of God standpoint, showing love, sacrificial love to the other side of the covenant. What could be greater than that? And what a better celebration of the covenant could there be than that? There's nothing more fitting on the Sabbath than to do that. And for the religious leaders, it's against the rules. So Jesus here is saying, number one, I am going to go die, because that is the ultimate fulfillment of the covenant. That is ultimate proof of covenantal love. There's nothing greater than that. And then he's saying, look, if you actually want to live in the kingdom of God, that's what you have to do as well. If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. The idea of giving in the covenant is the idea of living in the covenant. You can't have covenantal life without sacrificial giving. Because you don't, if you're not sacrificially living in the covenant, you're not living in the covenant at all. You're a thief and a robber. Jesus talks about this where he says that the sheep know the shepherd's voice, and the shepherd lays down his life for the sheep, but the thief doesn't do that. The thief comes in to kill and to steal. And so if you're in the kingdom of man, then you enter into these arrangements to kill and to steal. You enter into these arrangements to get what you can out of them. If you're part of the kingdom of God, then you enter into them out of love to bless the other side of the covenant, the other person in the covenant, the other entity in the covenant. You get into there and you say, how can I bless this other person? How can I help them, glorify them, bless them, help them to grow, help them to transform, help them to become more glorious and more fruitful? How can I do that? And in a way that loses itself. So Jesus says, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. Whoever would save his life, if you're all about your life and saving it, well, then you're going to lose it. But whoever loses his life, whoever gives up his life, says, just like Jesus, I want to live in the covenant. I'm going to give myself for the covenant. Then if you've done that, then you will find your life. And we talked about in our sermon this idea of, and it's a really important idea, that giving is what the covenant is about. And we kind of know this even though we don't know it. You know, it's clear. You can think of it this way. We talked about being Amazon's best customer, and how you can look at that as, well, look how much money I gave Amazon. Oh, that's terrible. How can I give less money to Amazon? Or you can look at it as, I'm Amazon's best customer. That there becomes a unity from that. Amazon needs you more than they need anybody else because you give more than anybody else. And that interrelatedness, that interdependence, is what the covenant is about, because the covenant actually takes two entities and makes them one. It makes them inseparable. It makes them a whole. So they are nothing without you, and you are nothing without them. Now, that doesn't mean that God is nothing without us, obviously, but it means that we manifest God here on earth, and that is the way that God is manifest here on earth. So the idea here is incredibly important, and one that the disciples have to learn. Now, they don't learn it right away, because remember, there's all these arguments the disciples have about who's the greatest and all that kind of nonsense. And Jesus just, there's the facepalm thing that happens where Jesus just can't believe that they're still arguing about these kinds of things. They just don't get it. And that's the funny thing, is that we spend so much of our life in the kingdom of man that we don't know how to operate in the kingdom of God. And some people will go through their entire lives looking at godliness, looking at religion, looking at Christianity, looking at their faith as yet one other tool in their bag of tricks to glorify themselves, and they'll never really enter into the covenant. And Jesus has a number of parables where he says, that he'll say, I never knew you. Go away, go out into the darkness where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. Well, why is the going out into the darkness where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth, why is that kind of the natural, just punishment or fate of the person who doesn't enter into covenant? Well, because that person is alone because they've chosen to make their existence about themselves. They're not attached to something else. They're not integrated to something else. They're not one with something else. They are alone. And so that's what happens. Now, then Jesus here says in verse 27, talks about how the Father, each one will get repaid for according to what he has done. And then he says, truly, I say to you, there are some that are standing there who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Now, there's a lot of interpretations of what Jesus meant by that. Some say that, well, John, the Apostle John, was never going to die. Some will say that he means something metaphorical and those kinds of things. Others will say that Jesus, the Son of Man, comes in his glory and establishes or comes in his kingdom in 70 A.D. in a way that is a precursor to ultimately the second coming. So there's a lot of opportunities for you to look into that and kind of figure out how you want to understand that last bit. The important thing here is that we understand the nature of the kingdom and how we participate in it. We'll see you guys next time.